So thank you, Ali, for inviting me to this series. And Ali and I are colleagues from the American Evaluation Association, which you may be familiar with or you may not be familiar with. I'll probably let her do more of that introduction, but I know, of course, there's the Canadian Evaluation Society as well, and who is doing great things in the environmental evaluation field as well. So I urge you to look into that further if evaluation is something that's piquing your interest. And I'll be saying this on repeat, but if you have any questions about this, what I'm talking about either now or afterwards, I'm more than happy to chat or email. So what I'm going to do today is this is kind of a smorgasbord, I would say. It's not going to be a particularly lesson driven or theory driven or anything like that. This is really going to be a sampling of different kinds of environmental projects that I've worked in or led over the years, over the course of my career, really. That will give you a sense of the different kinds of environmental, because of course that's very broad, projects where evaluation, and particularly social science types of data streams and research, can be integrated into those, and in fact are central to answering certain types of research and evaluative research questions. So I erred on the side of pretty pictures, which is actually, if you know me, sort of unlike me. I'm usually, I'm more often the, boring slide with too much information on it kind of person. But I'm learning, especially these days now, that it's all about keeping everybody awake. And making it interesting. So I hope that this will do that and serve that purpose. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of overview. And this slide, again, is this is my own montage of concepts. It's not, I can't credit anyone in particular because this came from my own mind and my own experience. And it's some considerations for the development of an evaluation project. And it's not all of them, it's not exhaustive, but this came from both, I think it can be used from both perspective of someone who might be interested in looking for an evaluation project to engage with. And it can also be used from the perspective of perhaps a person within an organization who is maybe new to evaluation and needs to think sort of from the perspective of internally as well. And so really quickly, obviously the thing that is valued and the mission, perhaps whether it's your personal mission in the case of someone looking to do something new and interesting, or certainly the mission of the organization should be the driver for where the focus begins. And then you start to look at the interventions and the setting, and you make some initial observations. And this process of inquiry starts, of course. And there's certainly lots of resources to bring to bear on this that I'm not going to be going into today, but certainly Ali or I can refer you to those. But certainly there's a whole stage where it's important to ask what kinds of inquiry and what kinds of information are actually appropriate for the situation, and whether evaluation in all its forms, which I also am not going into today, in particular, is appropriate. And then, of course, the idea of who would be doing the inquiring and who is the subject of the inquiry, and that's an important step as well, and cannot be glossed over, and certainly ties directly to questions of equity and inclusion and justice, and taking certainly looking through the right lens in terms of who's involved, who has power to say what in the end and for what purpose. So, and then there's a whole range of questions around methodology and whether it can actually be done. either funding wise or access wise, or even just the idea that an organization or an institution would like to be subject to such inquiry. So there's a lot to say there, and I'm glossing it over. But what I'm going to do here is basically these are some, and of course there are many more, environmental evaluation contexts that I'm going to be giving you examples about today. I'm going to give a few different examples of evaluation within the context of collaborative decision-making processes, science-based decision-making, and also including science research itself, just basic and applied research processes and what that looks like in different ways. I'm also going to give some examples of environmental health program evaluation activities. And this is very much, the examples I'll be giving very much reflect sort of the path my own career has taken, and I'll tell you more as I go along about that. But I started basically in the field of looking at contaminated waste sites and sort of what the issues were going on there, and that branched both into looking at chemical risk and working really solidly in the environmental health field for over a decade, and also working in areas that intersect with water quality and at times management of whole watersheds, which of course is related to ecological conservation, restoration, and the like. So I'll be talking about that. And in fact, evaluation is the thread that really connects all of these different contexts that I've worked in. And admittedly, I didn't even really realize that in sometimes until projects were, kind of coming to a conclusion. It's like these things are starting to add up. The same kinds of methods are being used in all different contexts to yield useful answers to questions that are applied and real. And that to me was always the most important driver for the work I did. I spent admittedly many years in higher education, but truthfully never with the goal of staying in academia. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But I was always interested in using inquiry to in the service of essentially environmental management, policy or management. And in my case, it's turned out to be much more on the management side than the policy side, with some exceptions. And I'll touch a little bit on monitoring and evaluation in the context of international development or sustainable development, and large-scale bank investments as well. Allie, I wasn't sure, did you want to just kind of have me go through my slides and then kind of discussion thereafter rather than pausing for questions?
It's entirely up to you. Either way has been done and works well.
Okay. Let's see here. I think I'm happy to take questions. I don't currently see everybody because of my screen situation here. So it may be that if people chime in and you can facilitate that, I'm more than happy to do that. So either way, it might be harder for me to see that right now.
So if you have a question right now, feel free to indicate so in the chat. We'll wait a minute, and then if not, Heather can continue on.
Okay, so let's see here. So I started my career actually out in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I am from, in California. And I started in a sort of backwards way, frankly. I was actually considering law school and environmental law, as many young people do. And while I was doing that, I was looking for something to actually, do in the meantime. And I got to the point where and this is now dating me, this is pre-internet. I looked in the back of the newspaper and I was thumbing through and I saw basically an ad from a local environmental nonprofit called the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition. And they were looking for volunteers to help them with projects. And that, having come from an undergraduate program at UC Berkeley, where I was focused on environment for much of my undergraduate career, it piqued my interest. And to make a long story short, I started volunteering for them. They were focused on contaminated sites and the issues around reproductive toxicity at many of the high-tech firms in Silicon Valley. That led to a project I worked on for about a year and a half at the U.S. Moffett Naval Air Station in Mountain View, California, where there was a public participation process going on around the contaminated site cleanup under the Superfund program here in the U.S. I ended up working for a small local consulting firm that had some Environmental Protection Agency money to provide the technical assistance for the community group, which was in this case, the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, to engage in the decision making at that site. And from there, it just sparked everything else that has since unfolded. My process of inquiry was really piqued when I had serious questions about whether community members were able to really truly engage in what was a very complex decision-making process involving a lot of technical data and ultimately a lot of risk-based decision-making. So I ended up taking this idea and going to graduate school with it. And in fact, this slide reflects my master's research, which was to look at the process of involving the community in military base closure and cleanup. And I used the Seneca Army Depot in upstate New York, which is a former nuclear weapons storage facility that the U.S. Army neither confirms nor denies per their policy, as my case site. And just as a fun side note, you will see behind the white circle that is indeed an all-white deer. And maybe some of you know this story, but it's a 10,000 acre military reservation that was fenced for over 40 years. And the deer population within it had a recessive trait for an all-white deer. And they, given that they had to manage the deer population within the boundary anyway, they managed it so that the population of several hundred deer was about 2/3 all white. It's not an albinism. It's a recessive trait, and it became, of course, local lore that these white deer had some connection to the chemicals and nuclear weapons stored at the site. But that's the entertaining part about delving into environmental work, because it always comes back to people and stories. And that's really one of the reasons that bringing a social science lens to environmental projects can be not only useful and central oftentimes to answering important questions, but also just fun and fascinating. So this evaluation was really an academic exercise. But I did work with the leaders and stakeholders at this site to basically provide what's called formative evaluation, which is sort of ongoing iterative feedback into their process along multiple parameters, including communication, group dynamics, perceptions and maybe misalignment of risk perceptions, lots of different facets. And I don't know how familiar or not you are with some evaluative terms, but basically formative evaluation is that which takes place sort of during a process for ongoing learning and feedback. And then summative is generally thought of as being kind of at the end of a process or a program to kind of reflect and account for the sum total of the accomplishments and outputs and outcomes of that program. So I'll be using those terms a bit here. So this work then launched sort of a related direction for me, which was that of working in watershed management, which at this time, which was about 25 years ago, was really taking off at the state and local levels across the U.S. In terms of setting up, depending on the laws of the state and localities, setting up either locally driven or state, or kind of more top-down state organized approaches to watershed management. And so I was able to work on several different projects listed here that had evaluative components to them. And this is where I'll say that this is kind of where the line between social science research and evaluation per se can get blurry. And I would probably argue that these projects were more on the social science research side, less on the evaluative side. But as I'll get to, I have a chart in a few slides that it's certainly it's a continuous process, right? And a cycle of essentially adaptive management and learning. And so different streams of information and data can inform next steps at sort of any point along that process. So these projects, one of them, the first one, was a really interesting 2-year project where we looked at, we evaluated the feasibility of using data that had been created and originated through a volunteer system of non-experts, non-agency folks, and to see the quality of that data for different purposes. And so the project had 2 full components to it. One was sort of clarifying both those actual methods in the field for water quality, as well as the quality assurance and quality control protocols that would go along with those. And then also having a sort of an institutional evaluation approach where we use social science research methods. In that case, it was interviews mainly, to essentially assess the potential feasibility through the lens of different decision-making bodies for whether they would ever even take these kind of data seriously. So that was an interesting project and successful because the findings actually did lead to New York State establishing a program for volunteer water quality monitoring in New York State. Similarly, and yet in contrast, in New Jersey, watershed management in New Jersey is organized at the state level, in contrast to New York, where it's county driven, or home rule, as we say. And so in New Jersey at this time, we were using methods of looking at a collaborative process that had been going on for several years across the state, and essentially gathering information about how that was working and not working. It was successes, lessons learned, pretty straightforward stuff. So again, evaluative in the sense that it was taking and using qualitative interview data to answer some questions, but really more tell a story. And in the case of Owasco Lake, we were doing similar things, but telling a story through information gathered through a public survey of the watershed community. So in each of these cases, I could go into the types of management decisions that these these data and these studies helped inform. So in one case, it was, should we invest further in essentially water quality monitoring, groups and work done by lay people. The other one was, how is this going at the state level, and what needs to be changed, what's going well. And in fact, it was actually, this was sort of the Whippany River ended up being a model study for what did work. And then in the Wasco Lake watershed, that's really about the management questions there were, gaining a greater understanding through data collection from people on the landscape about their behaviors, but underlying those behaviors, their understanding of watershed issues, their concerns, their perceptions, and how that relates to those behaviors. That's it's sometimes referred to as KAB research, knowledge, attitude, behavior research, or CAP, KA, knowledge, attitude, perception research. That can be really valuable for a range of questions. Excuse me here, I'm trying to forward here. So I could talk for an hour on each of these, so I better move forward. Another large decision-making, or rather collaborative process, was this evaluation that a team that I led in 2016. And this was actually a large-scale evaluation. So the methods here, we did all of these sort of in parallel, or back to back. It was a team of about 15 people, looking at retrospectively the process of developing the U.S. Third National Climate Assessment, which is a congressionally mandated quadrennial report to Congress, which details the impacts and expected impacts of climate change on the U.S. It was the most, this NCA, or rather the NCAs previous to the third NCA were done differently and were more piecemeal. And this third NCA was the most really broad scale, large process and report. It's over 1,000 pages online. And of course, now there's been a fourth, and they're gearing up for a fifth at this point, process. And so there was a lot of learning to be had. It didn't go perfectly, but in the end, it went amazingly well and produced a really high quality product. So we looked retrospectively at that, and told the story from the perspective of many folks that were developers or viewers or editors, and also users of the report and of that information. So it was a very large scale evaluation using a variety of methods. Different type of evaluation here is the type of process evaluation that is actually required for, at this point, a range of funded research in the US. In this case, this is the US Department of Agriculture, but evaluation is also now very integral to National Science Foundation funded projects, and it's really scaling up across federal agencies now with some new legislation that was passed just I think last year, the Evidence and Policymaking Act, and that's really going to drive, we hope, some, and it was very bipartisan, some new and much improved approaches to evaluating and learning from agency processes and programs. in a much more comprehensive and consistent way, and more high quality than has been done to date. So this reflects a project of mine that's actually current, which is helping to just provide formative and then ultimately summative evaluation findings for this project, which involves 3 universities that are conducting a collaborative research effort looking at pest control in organic cucurbit crops. And cucurbits include cucumbers and melons and pumpkins and other yummy things. And, you know, this is certainly about accountability. It's about quality and research. And it's, I actually don't know how long it's been a requirement at USDA, but it's certainly an example of the type of evaluation that that the other federal agencies in the U.S. are starting to really take much more seriously, despite our political situation, which I will not comment on. Like I said, I spent over a decade in what would generally be called the environmental health sciences. And that stemmed from my work at the military base closure sites. And I actually, a lot of my training was in environmental toxicology and risk assessment. And so I spent many years, 7 years, as a research and extension associate at Cornell, where I did my graduate work. After completing my degree, in a program that was focused on looking at environmental risk factors for breast cancer. This program is now sunsetted, but it was funded for over 15 years in New York State, and was a fascinating place to be because we conducted not bench science research, but what we called translational research, looking and developing a robust database of essentially what's now called systematic reviews or critical evaluations of risk factors, focused on different chemicals, including an array of agricultural pesticides and other types of pesticides. There was a whole side of our program that looked at diet and lifestyle factors for breast cancer. So fascinating program. We worked a lot with stakeholders around New York State. We were traveling a lot and spoke widely and worked closely with breast cancer advocates who were also working at the policy level and using science-based information that our program produced in their advocacy and policymaking. That program, being a program, needed to have evaluation. And in fact, it did. We had external evaluation as well as internal. And I would say that, you know, being positioned as a staff person within a program, if to the extent you have a system in place or are starting to put a system in place for some kind of tracking and reporting, that's an evaluative activity. So I was not, my role in the program was as a researcher and extension associate, but I include it here because essentially evaluation activities can take place in a range of settings, and both internal and external to a program or a process. And so we engaged in a lot of tracking of our own program metrics for purposes of reporting. In this case, it was to the New York State Department of Health, who then had to report to US EPA, which was the funding originator. Subsequent to that, I worked as a consultant at a larger firm for several years, where we provided a range of management consulting services to US federal agencies. I work mostly with US EPA and also the Centers for Disease Control and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR. And in particular, I provided and managed support to the US Office of Children's Health Protection. And that involved a range of essentially, again, certainly program planning, activities that were very closely tied to ongoing and iterative evaluation. So identifying metrics, program metrics, setting up the monitoring and tracking for those metrics. How are you going to collect the information for them, feeding them back and doing regular assessment and managing that process essentially with and for them as a consultant. And that has connected me again to work I'm doing currently here in Arlington, Virginia, which is working on an advisory committee for our public school system, which is focused on, the committee itself is focused on sustainability across the public schools and supporting teachers and student groups at a variety of schools across the district in environmental action, sustainability initiatives, and most recently looking more at things through a climate lens. And so we are currently working to take what was previously sort of a sustainability framework and frameworks that we use and school groups use in our county to provide green school activities, both at the infrastructure level and also at the programming level for the kids. And looking and seeing how we can best wrangle that data, collect it from already harried teachers. And of course, now it's all subject to change. But that's sort of one tie-in to evaluative activities that stems from that earlier work. So I'm happy to talk about the methods at any point, but I'm kind of also glossing over them, focusing more here on purpose and context, because I think that's kind of where, given this panoply here, I'll keep moving. So that brings us now to conservation evaluation, which I have some, I thought I would include this slide. For those of you who are not working in this field, this will be maybe new or maybe analogous to your work in other sectors. The conservation field has a whole history and a range of tools and resources. This is the open standards for the practice of conservation, though, has emerged as, over the last 2 decades, as sort of the clearinghouse for essentially an approach that defines and characterizes the adaptive management cycle of conservation projects, which is noted here in the diagram. My large fat blue arrows, which aren't particularly pretty, I've superimposed on this to illustrate mainly that it's still the case that I would say, even in conservation and environmental areas, that it's easy for folks to think of evaluation through a very narrow lens of only being, sort of this traditional idea of evaluating something when it's done and then saying something about it, and then not necessarily doing anything with that information. And, we all know the mantra of reports sitting on the shelf. That still persists. And even if for no other reason than in the lore. But there's often cases to be made still for evaluation, even across folks that are working in conservation. And so what this is trying to illustrate here is basically that evaluative activities and activities that fall within the much broader tent of evaluation exist at all points in the process of environmental management, and in this case, conservation. So results and or observations existing inform an initial assessment. Evaluation goes into, and thinking and tools go into planning, a variety of regular tools and approaches listed here, such as theories of change, logic or results frameworks, metrics and indicator development, and larger plans for monitoring and evaluation, should all go into the planning and not be done right at the end and in some last minute scramble. And this is holds true, I would argue, for the most smallest and localist and even really limited projects. The more you can incorporate evaluative thinking into your initial plans, as you set a process or a project up, the better off you're going to be when it comes time to tracking and being able to report and or understand anything about your results and your process. So certainly, if you're interested in tracking for any reason, which usually you need to do if you need to tell anybody about, especially funders, about what you've accomplished, that all of this, it gets incorporated. And then, of course, like I said, the formative evaluation can take place iteratively and often even in real time throughout a process. And then learning happens in the ideal scenario, where there's actually some reflection. And again, sometimes there isn't, but it's better if there can be that time taken, and some resources devoted to taking the time. And I would argue too that it's not worth investing in if you're not going to, if you don't take the time to reflect and learn. And so the cycle goes. So I've been really lucky to be involved in some really interesting evaluations of conservation grant making. The first one here is not the first one we did. Actually, these are not in order of how we carried them out, but this one was basically an evaluation of approaches that the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation here in the U.S., funded by EPA, in part by US EPA Chesapeake Bay program, were making investments they were making for over 2 decades across the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is a 64,000 square mile watershed incorporating 6 states and the District of Columbia, with the goal of improving water quality in the bay as well as protecting species such as the blue crab. And this particular grant-making portfolio was focused on nutrient and sediment runoff and reducing those across the landscape. And I could talk for days on this also, and I'm happy to share. Our report's actually available online. This was a very big undertaking, and we integrated environmental water quality modeling and data sets, environmental parameters, along with social science data streams from several surveys and interviews with grantees, interviews with folks in the watershed working on environmental and watershed issues who were not grantees. And the research question here, the evaluation research question, was really about how the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation was interested in how investments into new ways of reducing nutrient and sediment runoff were both working, but also how they were being shared across the landscape among folks working in areas of best practices, and whether adoption was taking place. It was looking at that dissemination dynamic of innovation. And we actually were able to measure that through some surveys and map it to some extent, along with mapping the modeled water quality improvements and sediment reduction. So it was multifaceted, and I'm happy to point you to the report if you're interested. Another type of evaluation for conservation that I led was a species conservation work, again for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, where the goal was of the grant making was to improve populations of Pacific seabirds. in 4 general locations of on-the-ground investment over a decade. And we conducted a mid-program review back in 2014. And species protection is a particularly kind of thorny one for our evaluation because of the life cycle of seabirds. They're long-lived, and of course they're out at sea. They live their lives out at sea, and they are not easy to track necessarily. They live on very remote islands. But moreover, the populations and the improvements to populations or to the types of metrics important to species protection, such as reproduction and survival and that kind of thing, are just not on the same time scale as grant making. And so in this case, we had to really tap into the scientific community and not just data, but in fact, talking to people, experts, seabird scientists proved to be what was needed here. And so we conducted an expert, part of this evaluation included an expert elicitation survey, where the survey was set up to elicit from experts in a systematic way their understanding of seabird dynamics and population survival metrics in different places for different species of focus for this project, which was 10 different species, along with also interviewing grantees who had been working on the ground, and also global experts who had a really wide-ranging view of seabirds worldwide and had knowledge on comparative situations for seabirds in other parts of the world, not Pacific, that also lent insight and sort of information to bring to what was being found for this program. And findings from this were NIFWF uses external evaluation findings to inform its grant making and how it writes its RFPs and how it structures and continues or doesn't continue programs. This was again another, there's 2 examples here. One again was for NIFWF, where we were looking at questions NIFWF had about how it engages people in conservation, and that was a project I conducted with a small team last year for them, looking across the entire range of grant making, across the entire foundation, around some specific questions they had about people and engaging people and communities. Another type of people-focused type of work I did for Pennsylvania Master Naturalist. That is a statewide program in Pennsylvania that trains people to engage in conservation and to be trained at a certain level in local conservation, and then they go forward and work in their communities in different ways. And so that program, for purposes of, and it's actually really a very small program in terms of actual staffing and resources. It's mostly volunteer driven, but it was important for some fundraising to be able to demonstrate what was coming out of the trainings. And so in that case, theories of change, looking at theories of change, the assumptions about how a program is going to achieve its goals, and then building logic frameworks and that sort of thing. That was something that was useful for Master Naturalists at that time, to be able to tell that story and bring the data they had been collecting about their different program activities and bring that into better and finer resolution for potential funders. And finally, and this is an area that I am working in currently. It's not an area I have worked in much. I'm new to it, which is, so I'm on my own learning curve, and it's really exciting, actually. This is my first foray into international work and evaluation, but I've had the opportunity to work on several World Bank funded projects, where World Bank is working with, in this case, the government of Vietnam to invest in large-scale infrastructure projects related to sustainable fisheries and also climate resilience. And so again, just like with the very, relatively small, Master Naturalist Program context, the same kinds of tools are used here. We very much use theories of change and results frames. In fact, they are baked into a very highly systematized organizational structure for the bank investments that goes into a very comprehensive package that a lot of people touch, dozens and dozens of people at World Bank, and also on the government side, and then on the provincial side, touch these documents as these very large, hundreds of $1 million investments in some cases are being prepared. So it's fascinating. That's one of the reasons evaluation is fascinating, because these tools can be applied in such limited, small, local settings, and also just really broad settings. So I'm ending it there. And in the age of COVID, I'm trying to, I'm actually happy that we're on Zoom more than we used to be, because I think it's a great way for people to connect, and frankly, it's a great way to get to know folks better. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk further, and I'll stop there because I think I really talked way too much.
Thank you so much, Heather. If anyone has questions, please indicate in the chat window, and we will call on you. And since I don't have any yet, I will start. One of the things that I think is really interesting about evaluation is that because someone else brings the research question to you, the flexibility in methods is really essential to being the best evaluator you can be. Whereas when you're developing a research question, you can tweak the question to sort of suit what you like to do and the methods that you like to work with. So I was wondering if you had an example of a time where you realized that the research question required a methodology that was not something you were terribly familiar with, or not something you particularly like to do.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So I think certainly some of the examples I showed you fit that case. And I didn't get a whole lot of time to talk about the difference in scope and scale across these different projects, but it was many of these, well, it just differs. So for instance, the Chesapeake Bay evaluation that we did required water quality modeling, which is a science-based activity, right? It is not it was the data were used in an evaluative setting, but in order to get that data, we needed to engage water quality experts. And that's not a one and done situation. I had to pull, I have a range of folks, and I often reach out and make new contacts in academia and elsewhere regularly for my projects. So I reached out, I started just getting on the horn, looking and making my own judgments about who would be looking at research, professors' research at different universities, and honing in on who would be, first of all, able to even help me identify who should be the best people for this, and then reaching out to those folks, and on and on. And I did that. So I recruited my own essentially group of experts in addition to the person who carried out the water quality modeling. And then there was also another layer of modelers and experts outside of our evaluation team who worked on the, in parallel, and were able to look at the analyses we provided. And it was in that way very collaborative, but it's highly technical in that sense. And there will often be data streams, especially in environmental evaluation, that for different questions need to be part of it, and you need to be able to engage and manage and understand how to bring in the right people.
Thank you. We're at time, but if anyone has a very quick question, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, we will say goodbye. And thank you so much, Heather. Any final questions?
I'm sorry we didn't leave more time for discussion, but please feel free to email me if you have any. I'd be more than happy to chat further. Thank you, Allie, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us. And thank
Thanks,
you, everyone,
Heather.
for attending.
Bye-bye.
Take care.